located in the village. No, it's not a village. Hi, so good to see you again. How have you been? Well, I hope you'll have a lovely day wherever you are, and if not, here's a hug. You're welcome. My name is Yurika, and I try to post true crime videos every week. Now, this week's case is a lot, so yeah, let's not divert into an intro that's boring as balls, and let's just get right into the story. Just before we do, though, a few disclaimers. This video is for storytelling and educational purposes only. In no way, shape, or form do I mean any harm to the people I talk about, nor any disrespect, apart maybe from the offenders, of course. Also, this video contains graphic descriptions of how horrible some humans can be to one another. As such, viewer discretion is advised. And also, before we get into today's video, I would like to say a huge thank you to my new sponsor. Just kidding. My sponsor is me, and even she's not that reliable at most times. So, anyways, the story. So, our case today takes place in Italy, a country that is known worldwide not only for their excellent cuisine and exquisite fermented grape juice, but also for one of the juiciest cases I've ever come across. See what I did there? So, sit back, relax, and let me tell you what occurred in the cold winter winds of 2010 in a small village located near the mountains, the Alps. In this quiet little town, as they almost always are, this one was called Byeeeee di Sopra. And there's a lot of Italian names in this one, and I really don't want to butcher them, but I also don't want to sound very pretentious. So we're going to see how that goes. So this little town was called Byeeeee di Sopra, and from its quiet streets lined with poplars and cypresses, trees, you can see the wooded mountains in the distance, their peaks turning blue-grey. I didn't write that myself, I saw it on a tourism information website. Now, the editor of the local newspaper there would once say that it is in the spirit of the mountain people to disdain gossip and not to repeat nonsense. And later on, you'll find out why that's a bit ironic. Now, Byeeeee di Sopra was located in the province of Bergamo, and Bergamo could kind of be seen as divided in two different categories, whereas the lower part of Bergamo, near the plains, was fashionable and well-connected and industrialized, and then the higher parts of Bergamo near the Alps was agricultural, remote, deeply traditional and religious, and it was just a close-knit place that was prone to nurture suspicion and also superstition amongst its people. And so in this little town of Byeeeee di Sopra, there lived a 13-year-old girl called Yara Gambirasio. Yara was kind, well-raised, bubbly, and very talented at gymnastics. Now, the latter was her biggest passion in life, and she trained multiple times a week at the local gymnastics center, which conveniently was only 700 meters away from her house. And in that house, Yara lived together with her family, her parents and her 3 siblings. Now, Yara's parents were well known and respected in the town. Her father, Fulvio, was a large, solid man with thick glasses. He was an architect. His father had been the local postman for years in the village, so everybody knew him and his family, as his grandmother, so his father's mother, had also been the local postwoman for years before that. And Yara's mother, she was named Mora, and she was a teacher in a nearby town. Yara had a very close bond, both with her parents and all of her 3 siblings, and especially with her older sister, who was 15, and she was named Keba. And besides Keba, she also had 2 younger brothers called Nathan and Jule, both under 10. So on a Friday night of the 26th of November 2010, Yara asked her mother at around 5 o'clock if she can bring a stereo back to her gymnastics instructor that she was going to need for a competition the next weekend. And now her mum knew it was only a 5-minute walk away, so she said, of course you can go, but you have to come back immediately after. I want you home as soon as possible. Yara said of course, and she went outside to start walking the 700 meters that would take her to the sports center. Shortly after, she arrived and she gave the stereo to her instructor. They chatted a bit, and then she left the gym at around 6:44 p.m. Now, unfortunately, it would turn out that Yara would never walk those 700 meters back to her house. At 7:11 p.m., Yara's mother phoned her daughter because she thought it was taking too long, and her call immediately went to voicemail. And now, because this is very unlike Yara and very out of character to be late but also not to be reachable on her phone, after 30 minutes of trying to reach their daughter, Yara's father called the police. Now, as this was such a quiet little village, nothing along those lines really happened ever around there, so the call was taken very seriously immediately, and they forwarded it to the public prosecutor's office. And the officer assigned to this case was Chief Police Investigator Letizia Ruggeri. Letizia was a 45-year-old badass former policewoman who had earned the respect of all her colleagues whilst she was fighting the Casa Nostra Mafia in Sicily. She was a bit of an unconventional one. She was a single mother to a daughter that was around Yara's age. She had long salt and pepper hair. She played classical guitar. She rode an old Vespa motorbike to work, which is not just like a moped, but it's actually closer to a motorbike. So pretty cool. And also, this woman had the black belt in karate. Basically, you don't mess with Letizia. By now, Letizia Ruggeri had been a magistrate for almost 15 years, and when she heard Yara was missing, she was immediately on top of this case. Obviously also because she had a daughter that was Yara's age, and she could only imagine what their parents must be feeling like right now. So Letizia Ruggeri immediately on the case. Within mere minutes, she had dispatched the state police, the Carabinieri and the military police all to Byeeeee di Sopra to go find out why Yara wasn't coming home. Now, the gym Yara was last seen at was part of a huge sports complex, and it had multiple tennis courts, it had a swimming pool, it had a running track, and it had many entrances and exits. So there were a lot of places where something could have happened, or where maybe Yara was hiding. Police quickly established that the last known contact that Yara had sent from her phone was a text message to one of her best friends, agreeing to meet up the following Sunday. And she sent this at around 6:44 p.m. And now, because Yara confirmed that she wanted to meet up with that friend, police thought that it was unlikely that she had run away or disappeared. Now, the entire village of Byeeeee di Sopra was shocked, and everyone wanted to help look for her. And so when Ruggeri launched a massive search, everybody in the town was involved to help look for Yara. And Ruggeri, she also called in tracker dogs, which would sniff the scent of Yara. And they used 3 of them at 3 different times, and each of them, instead of turning the direction towards Yara's house, immediately started sniffing the other way towards a town called Mapello. Now, Mapello is a town that is about an 8-minute drive away, so very close, and Yara's phone records would show that her phone pinged a cell phone tower in Mapello at around 6:49 p.m. So that's 5 minutes after she sent the text message to her friend. So this was a big lead, but with the dogs, however, because the winter was so gnarly and there was a lot of snow and frost, at some point, quite quickly, the dogs would lose Yara's scent. Now, investigations of this sort, Ruggeri would say, always start at the family of the person that is missing. So over the next few days, Ruggeri and her colleagues interviewed every single member of Yara's family to see if there were any secrets or indications of foul play within the family, or if there were fights and all that. However, nothing that was even remotely incriminating or suspicious regarding Yara's disappearance was found. So Ruggeri had to move on, and she wanted to be really thorough. So what she did is she wanted the phone records of all the phones that had pinged the cell tower in Mapello on that day or the evening around Yara's disappearance. This was about 15,000 phones, so that was a lot to go through. And not only would they read the messages of these phones, but they would also wiretap the conversations. And with one conversation with a Moroccan man, they asked an interpreter to translate what he was saying, and the interpreter said that this man was saying, "Please God forgive me, I didn't kill her." Obviously that rang a lot of alarm bells, and everyone immediately got on it. Now, the person that had said this was a 22-year-old man named Mohamed Fikri, and he was a Moroccan immigrant working on a building site in Mapello. However, by the time that investigators figured this out and realized who he was and where he would be, he was already on a boat to Tangier to see his family, because it took them 3 days to figure this out. Crap. However, Ruggeri and Italian authorities were like, okay, fuck that sideways, and they intercepted the ship that Mohamed Fikri was on to question him and arrest him. However, very soon it would turn out that he had a solid alibi and that he really couldn't be connected to the case in any other way, especially when they asked another few Moroccan immigrants, quite a few actually, to listen to the sentence the interpreter had heard and say what they think Muhammad was saying. And I don't know what they thought he said, but they all definitely agreed, I think it was 8 of them, they all definitely agreed that it wasn't, please God forgive me, I didn't kill her. He was saying something completely different. And so after this whole kerfuffle, Muhammad was released and cleared of all charges. And now the people of the area really liked him as a suspect, and Ruggeri would say that this was mainly because he was foreign and the people there didn't really like foreign, and she was really disappointed in that, and also a bit annoyed because as she kept trying on to solve the actual case, people kept bugging her saying that she should have never let him go and you let go the wrong guy. So Ruggeri was getting a lot of shit for that. But of course, our Leticia Ruggeri here is a badass bitch and just plowed on with the investigation. Now, one of the things that Ruggeri was investigating was all the CCTV footage and surveillance footage she could find. And quickly, a vehicle driving by the gym several times caught her eye. It was a small white utility van with an open back tray, and she found this vehicle passing also minutes before Yara had disappeared. Now, this whole case was big news, and the small town of Brembate di Sopra, with its proper and quiet little people, all of a sudden found itself in the center of a mystery, and national camera crews descended. Now, the Gambirasio family were actually horrified of this sudden publicity, and they really didn't like being in the public eye anyway. They were a bit quiet, and so they would lock themselves away, shutting the blinds and closing all the doors and the windows. And people talked about that as if it was weird, but personally, like, isn't that what you would do as well? Like, your daughter is missing and then there's this black cloud of journalists outside. I wouldn't do anything different, but they really didn't want any sort of contact with people. So when the people of the town came up with the idea of a torchlight walk in order for awareness for Yara, they also turned it down, and instead some nuns would pray with Yara's mother. She was an avid Jehovah's Witness. Also, instead of the torchlight walk, a mass was held for Yara, and the main statements that the family came out with were mainly just asking people to respect their privacy and give them some patience. However, a few days after Christmas, so a month after Yara's disappearance, Yara's family made their first real public appeal broadcast on television. They all seemed like they really weren't in a good place, obviously, and Yara's father Fulvio would make the following statement: "Open the door that separates her from her freedom. Please, give us our daughter back. We are a simple family, a household whose unity is based on love, respect, sincerity, and the glow of our peaceful existence. For the past month, we have been asking ourselves endless questions about who, what, how, when, and why this is happening to us. We are not looking for answers. We do not seek to know. We are not tormenting ourselves trying to understand. We are not pointing the finger at anyone. We just want immensely for our daughter to return to her world, to her village, to her home, and to the embrace of the ones who love her. We beg the compassion of the people who've taken Yara. We ask them to find some spark of love in their conscience. Look her in the eyes and open the door or gate that separates her from her freedom. We beseech you to give us our daughter back. Help us to piece our daily lives back together again. Help us to rebuild our normality. People know us. We have never done or wished ill on anyone. We have always shown that we are a very open and transparent family, always ready to help others. We do not deserve to continue our lives without Yara's smile. Thank you." Then, 3 months after Yara's disappearance, on the 25th of February 2011, a middle-aged man named Ilario Scotti finds the perfect spot to fly his new remote-controlled airplane. The spot he had found was an open field with very tall weeds and grass, 10 kilometers away from Brembate di Sopra, and it was surrounded by industrial estates and scrub yards. So Ilario is very excited to have found this new spot, and he starts flying his plane, but soon he notices that it wasn't really working properly, and so he was going to land it to see whatever was wrong with the plane. So he lands it amongst the tall grass, and when he walks over to it and reaches to grab it, in the corner of his eyes he notices some rags and rubbish laying there, but he doesn't really give it much attention until when he until when he got up again, because when he gave it a second look, he saw a pair of shoes. Now, absolutely mortified, Ilario immediately called the police, because obviously he knew Yara has been missing. And Letizia Ruggeri immediately comes down to the crime scene, and unfortunately it didn't take Letizia Ruggeri very long to establish that this was indeed the body of Yara Gambirasio. Obviously Ruggeri knew what Yara was wearing on the night that she had gone missing, and those shoes and a black legging and a black bomber jacket was exactly what was on this little girl's body. Near the body, they would find her iPod and her house keys, and also a SIM card and a phone battery, but not her actual phone. Also, the body showed to have multiple superficial wounds, probably made by a small sharp object as a knife or a nail, and she also had a large wound on her head. Now, even though it had already been 3 months since Yara had gone missing, the intense snow and aggressive frost of the winter months there had made it so that her body was kind of preserved pretty well. And so the police went on and collected as much forensic evidence as they could, and the body went to Italy's most famous pathologist called Cristina Cataneo. Now this pathologist, Cristina, she discovered traces of lime in Yara's respiratory tract and also pieces of jute in her wounds. And jute is a vegetable fiber that can be used to make rope with. She also concluded that indeed she had multiple sharp stab wounds from possibly a small knife or a nail, but these wounds weren't actually her cause of death because she hadn't really lost that much blood. It seemed that she had died from exposure to the cold weather conditions. In April of 2011, the researchers analyzing the forensic evidence on Yara's body were able to find some male DNA that had still been preserved after those 3 months of lying in that field. And the DNA that they found was not from saliva and not from sperm, but it was from blood on her clothing. It was on her underwear and her legging. And now they had determined that there was absolutely no evidence or any signs of sexual assault. So what they thought would have happened was that the attacker took Yara to the field and wanted to sexually assault her, but that Yara gave him such a good fight that she scratched him with her fingernails and resulting in some blood being on her clothing. It seemed like her attacker had just left her there. And now with this information of this male DNA that they had, they knew they had their killer, but they didn't know who it was. And so Ruggeri named this person who carried this DNA Ignoto 1, unknown male 1. And this, ladies and gentlemen, resulted in what would later be called Italian's most expensive manhunt, because Ruggeri launched a massive DNA search amongst the whole area of Bergamo. She wanted spit from everyone. Now, the police were responsible for taking the DNA of Yara's family members and her friends and her gymnastic friends, everyone that was close to Yara. And then the Carabinieri would concentrate on cross-referencing all the phone numbers that had passed through either Mappello or Brembate di Sopra or both at that singular day. And then each number that was found to be pinged in both masts, so in Mappello and Brembate di Sopra, was then tracked down and asked for a DNA sample. And also they continued to tap the phones of thousands of people. And also they went door to door asking if people would voluntarily give them their DNA samples. Now next to this, also a lot of people out of themselves would voluntarily just show up to give them the DNA. And in total in the area, over 20,000 DNA tests were conducted. And now, to bring this a bit into perspective, why this was so expensive and cost so much time is because it took 3 teams of geneticists, one in Rome, one in Palma, and one in Pavia. It took them a whole of 6 hours to convert one DNA sample into something that was readable on a computer. So you can only imagine how much work it was for all these 20,000 DNA samples that they had coming in. And also the cost in the machinery and manpower was immense. Then on the 28th of May 2011, so roughly half a year after Yara disappeared, Yara's family would finally get her body back so that they could have a proper funeral and mourn her and be close to her. And during the funeral, the entire town gathered together on the street and would applaud as the hearse with the white coffin with flowers on it drove from Yara's house towards the sports centre. The ceremony took place inside the sports centre, whilst the crowd outside on the parking lot could watch on a big screen, where they would also see Giorgio Napolitano, the president of Italy at the time, give his condolences to the family and her friends and loved ones. Yara was then buried, and lots of people would put small memorabilia on her grave, such as little notes or pictures, flowers, but also gym shoes. So it was really nice for the town and especially Yara's family to finally be able to mourn her. However, Letizia Ruggeri was still on the hunt for Ignoto Uno, unknown male 1. Ruggeri would have multiple hidden cameras installed, such as at Yara's gravesite, but also at the sports centre, and also at a local nightclub called Sabbie Mobili, which translates to quicksand. Now, this club had a kind of a semi-reputation for being a little bit criminal. I mean, as criminal as it gets in that area. So what they also would do is go stand outside of the club asking DNA samples from the people coming out of there. Surprisingly, one of the people that had voluntarily given his DNA to them was a bizarrely close match to Ignoto Uno. Close match, but not a full match. And now, what this said is that this person was probably family of the killer. So they needed to track this person down, and this was very easy because the club actually had a policy where if you wanted to enter the club, you had to create a membership card. And these membership cards also involved their phone numbers. Now, the clubber in question was a 20-year-old man named Damiano Gheranoni. And very quickly, it would become clear that Damiano definitely didn't have anything to do with it, because he had been in South America at the time. But still, his DNA was so similar to that of Ignoto Uno that they started to look deeper into Damiano's family. And when they got to Damiano's mother, a woman called Aurora, they were shocked, because it turned out that Aurora had actually been the family's housekeeping lady for over 10 years. And at this time, she wasn't anymore, but she had been for 10 years, and she had known Yara since she was born. They also had a close bond. Yara would always want to show her the new things she learned in her gymnastics class, and Aurora in return would be like, "Oh mio Dio, please be careful." And Aurora would say that she was devastated since she had heard the news of Yara's disappearance. And after looking thoroughly into Aurora and her son Damiano for one more time, it really didn't turn out that there was any incriminating evidence against them, and that this was just a bizarre coincidence. And in an interview, Ruggeri would actually say that it was just a crazy coincidence. There was no connection to Yara's disappearance whatsoever. You couldn't make it up. This whole case is crazy, which I agree with, but when Ruggeri said this, she didn't even know it was about to get a lot weirder even. But the question remained, if there was no connection, how could Damiano Gheranoni's DNA be so similar to that of Ignoto Uno, unknown male 1? So they started digging a bit deeper into Damiano's family and getting samples of every single family member, but not a single one was as similar as Damiano's DNA. And they had tested everyone until there was one person left, which they were thinking of not really needing to test, because this man was the uncle of Damiano Gheranoni, and this man had actually died in 1999. So there was no way that he could have been involved in Yara's murder. However, just to be sure, they did go to his widow, whose name was Laura, and they asked her, is there anything at all that you have that still might have his DNA on it? And Laura thought this was very weird, but obviously she was like, okay. And she searched for a bit and then came to the police station with a box. And in this box were 2 letters with postage stamps. One that was to renew his driver's license, and one was one he sent to his family. And the police and Ruggeri were hoping, really hoping, he had licked these postage stamps and that maybe a single bit of DNA would still be left on there. And miraculously, there was still usable DNA found on this postage stamp. And so they cross-referenced it to Ignoto Uno and to Damiano. And guess what? This DNA was even closer to that of Ignoto Uno than Damiano's. But what does that mean, you might think? Well, this meant that Giuseppe Gheranoni was the father of unknown male 1. Old Giuseppe had been the local bus driver. He had had his wife, Laura, and together they had 3 kids, 1 girl and 2 sons. They immediately started looking into their 2 sons. However, quite quickly, the 2 sons were cleared. Still, DNA technicians were 100% sure that Giuseppe Gheranoni had to be the father of unknown male 1. And now, because they only had a postage stamp with Giuseppe's DNA on it, to be really sure that it actually was Giuseppe's DNA, they actually exhumed his body from his grave to test the actual Giuseppe, and soon again they would find that the DNA of this exhumed body of Giuseppe was not only a match to the postage stamps they had tested, but also 100% the father of the killer. And this, kids, meant that somewhere out there was Giuseppe's illegitimate son. Commercial break! No, just kidding. So now, knowing this, Ruggeri and the team changed their perspective from looking for a man, because they had male DNA, to looking for a woman. The woman they thought they were looking for, they thought she had to be somewhere in her 60s and would have had an affair with Giuseppe decades ago, would have become pregnant.
Pregnant?
And then would have his son. And that son would then later become Yara's killer. I know, the plot thickens. Now the media, they picked up on this quite quickly and the whole area exploded with gossip, because they were such a proper and religious people that the idea of infidelity and illegitimate children was just shocking to them. I can only imagine those nonnas gossiping somewhere, saying like, I saw Stefano leaving his house very late last night. Well, I saw his wife talking to another man while she was doing grocery shopping. Those nonnas out there were loving the gossip about this, but were also very suspicious, like I said in the beginning, of everyone around them immediately. No one trusted anyone anymore. And basically the finger pointing just exploded. Now in the summer of 2013, so we're already a couple of years on because this search took so long, the staff of a nearby hospital chapel would call the police, saying that in their guest book, which normally would consist of people writing thank you notes to doctors or prayers for sick loved ones, in this guest book today, when they opened it, they had found a handwritten note saying, please tell the Bergamo police that Yara's killer was here. May God forgive me. Very suspicious. Now, however, there was no DNA or any fingerprints found on this note in the guest book. And also because they didn't really have any leads, the police said, okay, but we have this lead on Ignoto Uno and we are looking for his mother, and that's the thing we should focus on right now. And so they dug deeper and deeper, and the life of a young Giuseppe would begin to unfold. Giuseppe had moved there in the 60s, and he had become the local bus driver for 2 decades. And when they questioned his ex-colleagues, they said, oh yes, he was a ladies' man. And they would also say that loads of women would ride his bus to work every day because there was a local factory that loads of the women worked at. So yeah, we have a ladies' man bus driver who drives loads of women to work every day. Recipe for success, unless you're Laura, his wife, of course. Now, from this information, they could list 532 people as possible mothers of unknown 1. Villages were searched. Again, the police went door to door, and again, the gossip was spreading everywhere. All of a sudden, this allegedly very sober and Christian community was starting to have everyone's darkest secrets come out, because obviously they were digging into people that had affairs with other people. Drama town! Now, when they were checking off this list, they came across a woman named Esther Arzuffi, and they had found out that in the late 60s, Esther Arzuffi here had been the neighbor of Giuseppe Gheranoni and had worked at a textile factory for which he would have had to ride the bus every day to work. Of course, this bus was driven by Giuseppe. So Esther was married to a man named Giovanni Bussetti, and where Esther was very bubbly and outgoing, Giovanni Bussetti was an inward man who suffered from depression anxiety, and severe arthritis. So, could this Esther Arzufi be the killer's mother? Now, when questioned, Esther immediately denied having an affair with Giuseppe, but when they tested her DNA, it was very clear that in fact she was the killer's mother. Now, obviously, we want to know about her kids, and Giovanni and Esther together had 3 children, one set of twins, a girl and a boy, and another boy. Now, the other boy was quickly cleared, and the girl obviously as well, because they were looking for male DNA. I mean, I'm sure she was tested, but you know what I mean. And so then the only one they had left to test was the male twin. His name was Massimo Bossetti, and he was a 42-year-old man who worked as a builder, and he was the father of 3 children who lived with his wife together in Mappello. Do you remember Mappello? That's where Yara's phone last pinged. Massimo was a short and thin man with a pencil goatee that he bleached, and he also looked like a carrot. I can call him tanned, but he looks like a carrot. Also that goatee. And so they had arrived at testing Massimo's DNA. But what would be the case, ladies and gentlemen, is that Massimo was actually one of the few people in the entire area that hadn't submitted any DNA. So they had to obtain it, but also they had to do it without alerting anyone, him or his family members, because you don't know if they're in on it or not, that he was now their main suspect. So how were they going to do this? Well, they came up with a very sneaky plan. Quite close to his house, they set up a roadblock testing for drunk drivers, and Massimo would show up in his car with his wife and kids. And now the policeman conducting this test was actually very smart, as he told Massimo that the test unfortunately had been faulty and something had just gone wrong, and if he could maybe do another test. And of course Massimo was like, okay, yeah, sure. So the police officer pretended to throw away the test, but instead put it in a sealed evidence bag. And then he conducted another test on Massimo, and the officer said thank you, and they continued on their way. And now they had 2 admissible DNA samples of Massimo. And then on June 6th, 2014, the results came back. Now, to leave you on a cliffhanger for a little bit, let me explain something to you. To get a positive match on 2 DNA samples, they apparently have to have at least 16 compatible markers between the 2. And when the DNA sample of Massimo Bossetti came back, it turned out that he had 21 matching markers. So yes, kids, you've probably figured it out by now. Massimo Bossetti was Ignoto Uno. Finally, after 4 years, they had found Yara's killer. And not only that, but because they looked into his family so thoroughly, they actually figured out some other things as well. Some collateral damage, if you will, because they had found out that Esther Arzufi, so Massimo's mother, had actually had more than one affair. And it turned out that not only were Massimo and his twin sister actually the son and daughter of Giuseppe, bear with me here, also their oldest son was an illegitimate child. So going back to her husband, Giovanni Bossetti, this poor man on the same day would find out that not only was his son the killer of Yara Gambirasio, but also he wasn't his son, and actually none of your children are yours anyway. XOXO Esther Arzufi. And seeing as he was already suffering from severe depression and arthritis, one can only imagine how that man must have felt. Also next to that, Laura, the widow of Giuseppe, who had passed earlier, I hope you're still with me, Laura was infuriated that her husband had actually had an affair and had children out of that affair, and she had no idea. So for over 10 years she had been mourning her beloved husband, and now it turned out that he was a bit of a dick. But this wasn't the only illegitimate child they found. During this massive search they had conducted for unknown male 1, Ignoto Uno, police had actually uncovered a number of secret affairs and infidelities amongst the people in the area. In 2 small villages alone, 5 illegitimate children were discovered in different households. Basically, everybody was doing it with everybody, I guess. Now, we now know this, but remember at this point, Massimo had no idea he was now the main suspect in this case. But on the same day that they had discovered that he was definitely the killer, police en masse went to the building site where Massimo was working as a builder. And when they got there, they surrounded the entire site. Massimo saw them. He started running, which, guilty. But police quickly managed to get to him and arrested him on suspicion of the murder of Yara Gambirasio. Now what's interesting is that our peroxided goatee orange friend here was actually claiming from the start that he was innocent, which to me, it's like, well, why would you run then? But okay. He also claimed, and get ready for this because it's good, he claimed that his toolbox at some point had been stolen and that he suffered from regular nosebleeds that were very bad, and he would have had to use a cloth from the toolbox to wipe his poor nose with shirt. And now, because the toolbox was stolen, that was a perfect explanation for why his blood was just randomly laying around, right? Okay, so Massimo, let me ask you, so how did you nosebleed on Yara's underwear then? Next to this, his wife would make a statement that night he was at home with their 3 kids. Yeah, nice try, but the DNA technicians would testify that the odds of another DNA sample matching the same one were 1 out of billions and billions and billions. Billions and billions. That was my Trump impression. But basically, there was almost a 0% chance that anyone else would have a better DNA match to the profile of Ignoto Uno than Massimo Bossetti. And after this, more and more suspicious details would unfold, one of which was that they were able to match Massimo's vehicle to the vehicle seen driving suspiciously around the gym, the white open-back pickup truck I told you about in the beginning. Do you remember? And in the meantime, they had also managed to determine that the last time this vehicle, his vehicle, was seen driving by the sports centre was just mere minutes before Yara had disappeared. Massimo would also say that he was just on his way home from work, but quickly after asking his colleagues about it, they would confirm that he actually wasn't at work that day. So, and obviously also they had confiscated his computer, which on it had problematic evidence that he was actively interested in very young girls. And now that they knew who he was, they also managed to spot him hanging around Yara's house, hanging around her gym, and eating at a pizzeria down her street quite often in the days before Yara had disappeared. And for me, the cherry on top of this cake was that he worked on his tan twice a week, which is, look at my pasty white ass. How weird would it look if I'd be super tanned? Also in the summer, I don't tan. I just get less white or lobster red. So I don't know anything about tanning, but to me, it seems that getting a fake tan twice a week is not like super healthy. They also found that Massimo's phone had pinged in the area around the time that Yara had gone missing, and that he had actually turned off his phone at 5:45 p.m. that night, and he didn't turn it back on again until 7:34 a.m. the next morning. And through track records, they could see that this was unusual from what he normally did with his phone. They found out that the toolbox he was talking about that had been stolen, he had reported it missing, but that was 2 years after Yara's disappearance, so well done, mate. Now, throughout his preliminary hearing, Massimo would stay in jail until finally his trial would start at the 3rd of July 2015. By this time, Massimo still claimed he was innocent, and his wife also still stood by that he had been at home for dinner that night, which I thought was quite surprising considering all the DNA evidence that they have on him. Now, just like me, the prosecution was like, nah, bitch, and they produced a report of nearly 60,000 pages filled with inquiries, records, discoveries, experts, witnesses, and for witnesses, they managed to produce more than 711 and over 50 experts. And now, obviously, this was a bit too much for actual hearing in the trial. So what they did is they singled out 120, which I still think is a lot, 120 witnesses to testify in court against Massimo. Now, one of these witnesses was a local woman that said that on the night of Yara's disappearance, she had gone outside to take out the rubbish. And as she was doing so, a car matching the description of Massimo's vehicle sped by super fast, and she thought she had heard screaming come out of the car. And the day after, she immediately reported it to the police, especially when she heard Yara was missing. I don't know why she didn't get like the license plate. Also from the surveillance footage, the only question about this case that I have is if they saw the vehicle, wouldn't they be able to see a license plate on the vehicle? But I guess, I mean, I'm sure they thought of that and that it didn't work for some reason. Otherwise, they wouldn't have tested everyone's DNA to find the owner of the car. So also, 3 more witnesses came forward to contradict his claim that he had been home with his wife and kids that night. So yeah, it's not looking that great for Mr. Pumpkin Spice Latte over here. Now, because there was such a shit ton of evidence to go through, the trial took long as balls, and nearly after a year, finally, on July 1st of 2016, Massimo Bossetti would be found guilty of the murder of Yara Gambirasio and would be sentenced to life in prison. Now, in addition to that, the court of Bergamo also ordered a compensation of 3 million euros, of which 400,000 would go to Yara's parents, 150,000 for each of Yara's siblings, and then 18,000 for the lawyers. Now, Massimo immediately filed for an appeal, but this was denied multiple times over the past few years. Nowadays, Massimo is still in prison, and the bricklayer has actually dedicated himself to poetry. And for this, he doesn't use his real name. He writes under the pseudonym of Nicolas Comi, or Nicola Gomi, which is his son's name and his wife's surname. And under that name, he partakes in various prison writing competitions. And actually, last year, he received the 3rd prize for the competition Writers Inside for his poem titled I've Lived in the Hole for 7 years, which, okay, I shouldn't do this. Well, I think you can make fun of accents as long as you do it respectfully, because I mean, I really would understand if people made fun of a Dutch accent, because we sound a little bit like this, and we say hè after every sentence. If you go left there, hè, you will see the building is very nice, very exciting. And also, we put chocolate sprinkles on our bread. Now, hè? Go figure that out. Sorry. But okay, so I don't want to like offend anyone, but I hear this poem that I'm going to read to you, obviously. I hear this with like an Italian accent, and like I see this man as a not very smart man who's orange and has a peroxide goatee. So when I read I've lived in the hole for 7 years, what I actually heard was I've lived in the hole for 7 years. I think that was more Spanish. I kind of sounded like Carlos Sainz. I'm sorry. I don't mean to offend anyone. Anyway, let's read the poem he won 3rd prize with. I'm gonna do it in an English accent. There is my cot, my stool, my Jesus, which I'm like, Jesus is your shitter? Or anyway, the rest of life hangs on the walls, at least what remains. For 7 years, I have known every crack. I bet you did. The cracks in the walls, the floors, cracks in my heart. No. I don't know what, I don't know how much I'll find outside this concrete hole. Well, at the moment, actually, Massimo, it's kind of looking like World War III. So it's not that great outside the walls, but, you know. For 7 years, I've been speaking to the stars, to the moon. To the moon! sorry. I have been speaking to my loved ones, thus trying to escape the pain and suffering, only to be met with infinite deafening silences. Well, that's actually, Massimo, that's because you killed a 13-year-old girl, and in most cases, if you do that, people don't really, want to talk to you anymore. People don't tend to really like that, but, just a tip. I've been thinking about the day I'll be out for the past 7 years. I'll need another 7 years to help me live. Well, no worries, babes, you're gonna get those 7 years and more. Oh, certa sweetikins. So yeah, that was a crazy story of how they managed to find Yara Gambirasio's killer. I know, right? And actually, when I started this whole true crime thing, I thought I didn't want to do cases about children or that involves the harm or assault of children. But the way they managed to solve this case was just such a roller coaster. And also, all of the main true crime YouTubers I follow haven't really done this case. So yeah, here we are. Also, doing research on this case was crazy because a lot of the articles were in Italian, but I just found the whole storyline so fascinating that it was totally worth the hyperfocus. You're welcome. Now, to end it off, my thoughts go out to Yara's family and the lives she touched. And they have kept quiet over the years, but what they did do is present a gymnastics award in Yara's honour. And meanwhile, the town of Brembate di Sopra remembers Yara fondly, whilst also trying to recover from having all their darkest infidelities and secrets exposed. Thank you so much for sitting with me today and hearing this story. Sorry. I will be posting content like this, hopefully every week, and other shenanigans that my brain manages to come up with that week. So yeah, if you're like, oh my god, that's like totally up my earlier, please feel free to gently snootboot the subscribe button, but also please the like button, because otherwise she feels left out. And yeah, if you do so, I will radiate all my love towards you in return. Welcome. And lastly, please check the description box below, because just like last week, I've put down websites of where you can help and how you can help in either Ukraine or different war zones around the world. So please go check them out and see what you can do to make the world a better place. So now, have a lovely day, be kind to yourself, tell the ones you love that you love them, and I'll see you next week. Bye!